before she arrived, my world was one of straight lines and hard truths. Order. It was the principle upon which I, Alastair, Earl of Croftwood, at 35 years of age, had built my entire existence. My estate, Croftwood Manor, was a testament to this creed. Its stones were solid, its gardens were precise, and its halls echoed with a quiet, dignified purpose. It was a world of logic, of loyalty to the crown, and of a deep, abiding respect for the laws of God and King George. Treason, to me, was not a political disagreement. It was a cancer, a rot that threatened the very soul of England, and I despised it with every fiber of my being. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a mud-spattered rider who had pushed his horse to its limit. The sky over the moors was the color of old pewter, a relentless, weeping gray that promised a week of rain. I remember the scent of the damp wool from the messenger's coat as I took the scroll in the great hall. The wax seal had borne the crest of Lord Harrington, a man who had been more of a father to me than my own. His hand, I knew, had been too weak to press the signet ring himself. The impression was faint, almost apologetic. My heart seized. I knew, even before I broke the seal, that these were the words of a dying man. I retreated to my study, the one room where the world could be held at bay, and with the fire crackling in the hearth, I read his final command. It was not a request. It was a testament, a final burden laid upon the only man he trusted to bear it. Alastair, it began, the script wavering and faint. I write this from my deathbed, and my final thoughts are of a promise I can no longer keep. You know of Lord Ashworth's folly, his damnable choice to follow the pretender. He is condemned, and his name will be erased. But his sister, my goddaughter, Ilara, is innocent in this. She is a gentle soul caught in a tempest, not of her making. By the love you bore me, I charge you with this task. Protect her. Hide her at Croftwood until the storm passes. No one must know. It is my last wish, my final prayer. Do this for me. I read the letter 3 times. With each reading, the rage inside me grew colder, harder. Lord Ashworth, a traitor of the highest order, a man who would see our nation plunge back in a bloody conflict for a foreign-sponsored king. And I, an earl who had publicly condemned such men, was now commanded to harbor his sister. It was poison. It was a violation of every principle I held dear. To shelter the kin of a traitor was, in the eyes of the law, treason itself. He was asking me to risk my name, my lands, my title, my very life for the sister of a man I would gladly have seen hanged. My mentor in his final moments had shackled me to the one thing I could not abide. For 2 days, I paced the length of my study, the letter a burning coal in my hand. I considered burning it, pretending it never arrived. But my debt to Lord Harrington was absolute. He had guided me, sponsored my entry at court, and shaped the man I had become. To deny his last wish would be a betrayal of a different, more personal kind. And so, with a heart heavy with resentment, I sent a single, coded message to a trusted contact in London. The package will be collected. My home, my sanctuary of order, was about to be defiled. I told my staff only what was necessary, that a distant ward of Lord Harrington, a young woman in distress, would be staying with us indefinitely. I saw the questions in their eyes, the practiced lack of curiosity that servants master so well. My housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose loyalty was as solid as the manor's foundations, simply nodded. Her rooms will be prepared, my lord. The east wing, perhaps, is more private. I agreed. The farther away, the better. The night she was to arrive, the promised rain finally broke. It was a torrential, angry downpour, lashing against the windows of the study as if trying to break in. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind whistling through the eaves, sounded like the approach of my own ruin. I drank more brandy than was my custom, the liquid fire doing little to warm the ice in my gut. I imagined her arrival, a weeping, hysterical woman, full of political fervor and misplaced loyalties. A zealot who would try to convert my own servants to her brother's wretched cause. I steeled myself for arguments, for tears, for defiance. The carriage arrived well after midnight, a black shape moving through the deluge, its lamps casting slick, dancing reflections on the flooded cobblestones of the courtyard. I watched from the window, a nameless dread coiling within me. I did not go down to greet her. An earl does not greet the sister of a traitor. I sent my steward, a man of immense discretion. I remained in my study, a king in a castle under siege from within. An hour later, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Mrs. Gable. She is here, my lord. She has been shown to her rooms. She did not wish for supper. There was a hesitation in her voice I had never heard before. Is there a problem? I asked, my voice sharper than intended. No, my lord. It is only, she is not what we expected. And what precisely did you expect? I do not know, my lord. But not this. She paused. She is silent. The word hung in the air. Silent. It was not the word I was prepared for. The following morning, I knew I could not avoid it any longer. I had to see the source of my dishonor for myself. I walked the long corridor to the east wing, the portraits of my ancestors staring down at me, their painted eyes seeming to judge my every step. The wing was quiet, unnaturally so. I found her in the small morning room, standing before a window that looked out onto the rain-swept gardens. The carriage door had opened, and she had emerged. Not a defiant political firebrand, nor a weeping damsel. She was nothing. A slip of a girl, swallowed by a gray traveling cloak. Her face was pale, her eyes cast down, and she moved with a fragility that seemed an affront to the solid, unforgiving stone of my home. And she was silent. Utterly, unervingly silent. Now, seeing her in the gray morning light, I understood what Mrs. Gable had meant. She stood with her back to me, a slender silhouette against the rain-streaked glass. She wore a simple, dark dress, and her brown hair was tied back without adornment. She had an air of neglect about her, as if she had been forgotten by the world long before her brother's treason had made her a fugitive. I cleared my throat. Miss Ashworth. She flinched, a small, violent tremor, but she did not turn. I felt a spike of irritation. Was I to be ignored in my own home? I stepped further into the room. I am Lord Croftwood, your host. Slowly, she turned. Her face was thin, her complexion almost translucent, suggesting poor health or prolonged fear. But it was her eyes that held me. They were a deep, sorrowful blue, and they were wide with an animal terror. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. Not a whisper, not a breath. She simply stared, her hands clutching each other so tightly her knuckles were white. This was not defiance. This was a cage of silence, and she was trapped within it. My housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman of iron will, had crossed herself almost imperceptibly as the girl passed through the halls the night before. The footmen refused to meet her gaze. The silence she brought with her was heavier than any storm. They saw her as a bad omen, a ghost tied to treason. In that moment, I saw only a burden, a broken thing I was now responsible for. What would you have done in my place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I would be honored to know where you're watching from. I looked at this mute, terrified girl, the sister of my enemy, and felt nothing but the bitter weight of a promise I already regretted keeping. The first week was a trial of patience. Her silence was not peaceful. It was a living entity, a void that absorbed all sound and comfort from a room. She took her meals in her chambers, and for that, I was grateful. The thought of sitting across a dining table from that gaping quiet, from those haunted blue eyes, was more than I could bear. My life, once a fortress of predictable rhythm, now contained a variable I could not control or understand. I threw myself into the estate's accounts, rode out to inspect the tenant farms with a renewed vigor, and spent my evenings in the company of my hounds and a bottle of port. I tried, with all the considerable force of my will, to pretend she did not exist. But Croftwood Manor, for all its size, was not large enough to render a person invisible. I would catch glimpses of her, a flash of her dark dress disappearing down a hallway, or the sight of her solitary figure walking the length of the walled garden, her head bowed against the wind. She never seemed to look at anything directly, but rather past it, as if her gaze was fixed on a memory only she could see. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, and made no sound. She was the perfect prisoner, and yet her very presence was a constant accusation, a reminder of the treasonous secret I now kept. My irritation with her began to curdle into something more complex, a grudging curiosity. I had expected a zealot, a woman consumed by her family's disastrous politics. But there was no fire in her, only ash. One afternoon, seeking refuge in a library, I found a book of Greek tragedies left open on a reading stand near the window. It was a volume I hadn't touched in years. A single, dark spot marred the page, still faintly damp. I touched it with my finger. A tear. She had been here, weeping over the sorrows of Hecuba. The sister of man who would bring ruin to England was not reading political pamphlets, but mourning an ancient, fictional queen. The thought was so incongruous, it was almost absurd. It did not fit my narrative of her. A few days later, a more significant event occurred. From my study window, I saw her in the rose garden. We'd had a terrible storm the night before, and a young thrush had been thrown from its nest, its wing clearly broken. I watched as she knelt in the mud, her fine dress bedamned, and gently cupped the terrified bird in her hands. There was a tenderness in her movements, a focused maternal care that was utterly at odds with the haunted, vacant girl I thought her to be. She carried it back towards the shelter of the east wing, presumably to a warm place where it might have a chance to mend. For the first time, I saw not the sister of a traitor, but simply a woman trapped in a cage of silence, who still possessed a heart capable of profound gentleness. It was a fleeting moment, but it shifted something within me. If you've ever had your judgment of someone completely overturned, please leave a like to show your support. The reports from Mrs. Gable began to change in tone. Her initial fear had softened into a kind of frustrated pity. The young lady is fading, my lord, she told me one evening, her brow furrowed with genuine concern. She eats barely enough to keep a bird alive. And speaking of which, she has one in her room with its wing and a splint made from a twig and a strip of her own handkerchief. She reads, my lord, or she sits by the window. That is all. It is not natural for one so young to be so still. Stillness. That was the perfect word for her. A stillness of the body and a stillness of the voice. I began to wonder what storm had caused such a profound calm. What terror could be so absolute that it stole a person's very sound? My image of her, as a willing participant in her brother's schemes, was crumbling, replaced by the unsettling possibility that she was a victim, another piece of collateral damage in the brutal game of thrones and loyalties. This thought did not bring me comfort. It was easier to resent a conspirator than to pity an innocent. Pity implied a duty beyond merely hiding her. It implied a duty of care, of understanding, and I wanted no part of it. The outside world, however, did not care for my internal struggles. A letter arrived from a contact at court, a man who kept me apprised of the political winds. His words were a splash of icy water. The Crown, in its fury over the failed rebellion, had appointed a special agent to root out any remaining Jacobite sympathizers. His name was Lord Beaumont, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. He has the king's ear, my friend wrote, and he is making a name for himself with public confiscations and swift trials. He suffers no fools and suspects everyone. He is currently sweeping through the northern counties, and they say he has a nose for secrets like a hound for foxes. Be wary, Alistair. Your family's name is one of honor, but these are dangerous times to be honorable. I've burned the letter, but the name Lord Beaumont was seared into my mind. The abstract danger I had feared had now taken on a concrete form. It was no longer a faceless possibility of discovery. It was a man, a hunter, and he was moving closer. Every unexplained noise in the night, every stranger seen on the road, became a potential threat. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, and I, the master of the house, was as much a prisoner as the silent girl in the East Wing. My resentment for her began to return, sharpened by fear. It was her fault, her family's fault. I found myself watching her with a new critical eye. Was her silence a clever ruse? A way to feign innocence? Was her gentle demeanor a mask for a cunning mind, plotting and waiting? I began to search for cracks in her facade. I would enter a room she was in abruptly, hoping to startle a word from her, to catch her off guard. She would only flinch, her eyes wide with that same damnable terror, and the silence would rush back in, thicker than before. My suspicions felt like poison, turning me into a man I did not recognize, a jailer tormenting his charge. One evening, unable to bear the confines of the manor, I walked out into the gardens as dusk was settling. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and coming rain. I saw her near the old sundial, her back to me. She wasn't looking at the sky or at the fading light. Her attention was on the stone itself. As I drew closer, silently, I saw she was tracing the carved Roman numerals with her finger. And I heard it, a sound. It was not a word, but a low, guttural hum, a note of profound and utter despair, as if she were trying to force a sound from a mechanism that had long since rusted shut. It was the most heartbreaking sound I had ever heard. She must have sensed me because the sound choked off instantly. She spun around, her face a mask of horror at having been caught in such a raw, involuntary moment. I saw shame in her eyes. She was ashamed of her own voice, of her own brokenness. In that instant, all my suspicion, all my resentment, evaporated, replaced by a wave of something I could only identify as a profound and aching pity. This was not a conspirator. This was a soul in torment, and she was my responsibility. The walls were closing in, both from the outside world and from the silent woman within my house. If you want to find out how this impossible situation unfolds, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the conclusion. I stood there, frozen, as she gathered her skirts and fled back to the house, leaving me alone with the falling darkness and the terrible weight of what I had just witnessed. The days that followed the incident at the sundial were heavy with a new kind of silence. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with the memory of that raw, broken sound. Alara retreated even further into herself, her rare appearances in the corridors and gardens ceasing altogether. She was a ghost confined to her quarters, and I felt her absence as keenly as I had once felt her oppressive presence. The shame I had seen in her eyes had become my own. I had pushed her, I had hunted her for a sign of weakness, and when I found it, the victory felt like ash in my mouth. My quest to expose a conspirator had only revealed the depths of a woman's suffering, and the knowledge was a burden far heavier than my mentor's original command. The rain that had threatened for days finally returned, not as a passing storm, but as a permanent state of being. It fell in a relentless, gray sheet, blurring the world outside the windows into a watercolor of greens and browns. The sky was a low, oppressive ceiling, and the manor, which had once felt like a fortress, now felt like a tomb. For 3 days it rained without cease. The staff moved about with a hushed melancholy, the sound of the downpour a constant, mournful companion. I found myself restless, unable to focus on my books or ledgers. The walls of my study felt as if they were closing in on me, the solitude I normally craved now feeling like a punishment. On the third afternoon of the ceaseless rain, I abandoned my study and sought the one room in the house that had always offered solace, the library. With its towering shelves of leather-bound volumes and the grand fireplace at its heart, it was a sanctuary of knowledge and warmth. I entered quietly, intending to lose myself in some history of a long-forgotten war, anything to distract from the war I was waging within my own home. And then I saw her. She was there, in the far corner, curled in the large, winged armchair that overlooked the main gardens. I had never seen her in this room before. She wasn't reading. She was simply sitting, her small frame almost lost in the great chair, watching the rain cascade down the leaded glass panes. The room was cold, the fire unlit. She wore the same simple dark dress, and a gray shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, less for warmth, it seemed, than for comfort, like a child holding a blanket. She did not notice my entrance. Her focus was entirely on the deluge outside, her expression unreadable. My first instinct was to retreat, to leave her to her solitude and find my own elsewhere. But I was tired of retreating. I was tired of the silence, of the fear, of the space between us that felt as vast and cold as the rain-swept moors. Without a word, I walked to the great stone hearth. I knelt, struck flint to tinder, and coaxed a small flame to life. I laid kindling upon it, then a small log, and slowly, a warm, crackling fire began to push back against the room's chill. The light flickered across the shelves, catching the gold leaf on the spines of books, painting the room in moving shadows and a soft, orange glow. I felt her gaze on me. I rose and turned, and for the first time, there was something other than terror in her eyes. There was surprise, and beneath it, a flicker of something unidentifiable. I gave a stiff, formal nod, and retreated to a chair on the opposite side of the hearth, picking up a book at random from a nearby table. I did not open it. We sat there for what must have been an hour, the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain against the glass. It was not the suffocating silence of before. It was a shared quiet, a truce. The fire I had built was a warmth between us, a small island in the vast ocean of things unsaid. I finally risked a glance at her. Her gaze had returned to the window, but her hands were twisting the fringe of her shawl in her lap, a sign of some inner turmoil. She seemed to be wrestling with a decision of monumental weight. Her breathing was shallow, her lips pressed into a thin line. I looked back at the fire, determined to give her the space she needed, to not be the cause of any more fear. Then I heard the soft rustle of her dress against the leather of the chair. I looked up. She had risen to her feet and was standing before me. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the firelight, and her eyes were fixed on mine. There was fear there, yes, but it was overshadowed by desperate resolve. Her hands, trembling visibly, reached into a small satchel at her side when I realized she always carried. They emerged holding a small, unassuming book. It was a diary, bound in worn, dark green leather, its edges softened by time and handling. It was not elegant. It was a simple, personal object, and the sight of it made the air in the room grow thick. She took a single, hesitant step forward, then another. She stopped directly in front of my chair, so close I could see the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. Her eyes were pleading, begging me to understand the magnitude of this offering. This was not a book. This was her soul. This was her voice. Slowly, like a supplicant at an altar, she extended her hands and offered it to me. I stared at the diary, then back at her face. My mind reeled. To accept it was to cross a line. I would no longer be her reluctant protector, her wary jailer. I would become her confidant, the sole keeper of the truths she could not speak. It was a trust so profound it terrified me. The risks were immense. What secrets did it hold? Secrets of her brother's treason? Secrets that could endanger me even more? But looking at her face, at the raw vulnerability and the sheer, desperate courage it took for her to make this gesture, I knew my own safety no longer mattered as much as it once had. Her story mattered more. The courage it took for her, a person silenced by the world, to offer her innermost thoughts to the man who represented her captivity. It was a profound act of faith. If this story of quiet courage is touching your heart, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a tale of resilience. My hand rose, seemingly of its own accord. My fingers were steady as they brushed against hers. The brief contact a spark of warmth in the cold room. I took the diary from her. It felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the years of silence it contained. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for an eternity, a faint, shaky sigh of relief. Without a backward glance, she turned and fled the library, leaving me alone with the fire, the rain, and the key to her entire world. I sat there for a long time, the leather cover cool against my palms. The moment felt sacred, a turning point from which there was no retreat. I had been forced to shelter her body, but she had just willingly entrusted me with her mind. With a deep breath, I opened the cover. The first page was filled with a neat, elegant script, the lines perfectly straight, a stark contrast to the chaos of her life. And as I read the first words, the world outside, the rain, the threat of Lord Beaumont, all of it faded away, and only her voice remained. It began simply, a declaration of existence against all odds. My name is Alara Ashworth. I am 22 years old, and though the world has stolen my voice, these pages will be where I refuse to be silent. I sat in the great winged armchair, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, and I began to read. The world outside the library ceased to exist. The rain, the wind, the ticking clock in the hall, all of it dissolved, replaced by the silent, powerful cadence of her written words. I did not read for an hour or two. I read through the entire night, as the fire burned down to glowing embers and the darkness outside softened into the gray promise of dawn. I read of a life I could not have imagined, a story of such quiet sorrow and profound strength that it dismantled the man I was, brick by brick, and rebuilt me as someone new. She wrote of her childhood at Ashworth Hall, a place of sunlight and laughter. She was not born silent. She was, by her own account, a chatterbox, a girl who loved the sound of words and the stories they could weave. She described her older brother, Michael, not as the traitor I knew, but as a laughing, vibrant young man who would lift her onto his shoulders and call her his little sparrow. They were inseparable, two halves of a whole, their world safe and bright. Her words painted a picture of an idyllic life that made its eventual destruction all the more heartbreaking. The diary was her only way to remember the girl she used to be. Then the tone shifted. The light faded from the pages, replaced by shadow. She wrote of the day the silence came, when she was 16 years old. It was not a sickness, not a flaw of birth. It was stolen from her. Her brother was away in London. Political tensions were high. Their father, a man of strong opinions but cautious action, had been accused of harboring sympathies for the Stuart cause. One evening, she had been searching for a lost book in the estate's chapel when she heard voices. Hiding in the choir loft, she witnessed a scene of unimaginable brutality. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Royalist dragoons, led by a captain whose face she described with chilling clarity, had cornered 3 of her father's most loyal retainers. They were accused of conspiracy, but there was no trial. There was only the cold pronouncement of guilt and the swift, merciless flash of swords in the torchlight. She wrote of the scent of blood, the sickening sound of it all. She must have made a noise, a gasp of horror, because the captain looked up, his eyes locking onto her hiding place. He sent his men away. He climbed the stairs to the loft, his boots echoing in the sudden, terrible quiet. She was paralyzed by fear. He stood over her, his sword still dripping. She saw the cruel smirk on his face, the casual indifference to the lives he had just taken. He did not kill her. He did something worse. He pressed the flat of his cold, bloodied blade against her throat and whispered words that would become her prison. "You saw nothing, little bird," he'd said. "If you ever speak a word of this to anyone, your father, your brother, a priest, I will know, and I will return. I will not be so gentle with your brother as I was with these old men." He smiled then. "So you'll be silent. Forever. It will be our little secret." And she was. The terror of his promise, the image of what he could do to Michael, sealed her lips. Her voice was the price of her brother's life. When she was found hours later, she could not speak. Doctors were called, specialists consulted. They called it a hysterical affliction, a malady of a weak female mind. Her father despaired. But Michael, when he returned and learned of it, became consumed by a cold, burning rage. He did not know the specific secret she kept, but he knew the world had broken his sister. He saw the crown's justice not as order, but as the tyranny of men like that captain. Her silence became the fuel for his rebellion. He wasn't fighting for a foreign king. He was fighting a world that had brutalized his family and silenced his sister. She didn't excuse his treason. In her diary, she wept for his choices, for the dark path he had taken, but she understood the rage that drove him. She loved the brother he had been, and she was terrified of the man he was becoming. I felt a profound, burning shame. My judgment, my smug sense of righteousness, my disdain for her sickly appearance. It was all a monstrous ignorance. Her fragility was not weakness. It was the result of carrying an impossible burden for years. Her silence was not a flaw. It was a shield, an act of selfless, terrifying love. She was not a conspirator. She was a hero, fighting a silent war every single day of her life. The pity I had felt for her was an insult. What I felt now was awe, a deep, soul-shaking reverence for the strength of this woman. The diary continued, detailing years of profound loneliness. She wrote of being treated like a fragile doll, an object of pity. She wrote of her frustration, of screaming in her dreams only to wake up to the same suffocating quiet. She wrote of watching people, learning their characters from their expressions and actions, becoming a student of the unspoken. She had seen more truth in the world through her silent observation than I had ever seen with my loud, confident pronouncements. As I read the final entry, written the night she had arrived at Croftwood, my heart stopped. "I am in the home of the Earl of Croftwood now," she wrote. "He is my protector, but he looks at me with contempt. He sees me as a stain on his honor. I do not blame him. He is a man of principle, and I am the sister of a man who has betrayed every principle he holds dear. I am afraid of him. But there is something in his eyes beneath the anger, a sense of duty, of honor, that my brother has lost. I pray that it is enough to keep me safe. I am so tired of being afraid." I closed the diary, my hands trembling. She was afraid of me. She saw honor in me, even as I was drowning in my own resentment. The depth of my failure, of my misjudgment, was absolute. And in that moment, as the first rays of dawn pierced the gloom of the library, a new feeling rose within me, fierce and undeniable. It was not pity. It was not awe. It was love. A fierce, protective love for the woman who had trusted me with her shattered soul. I knew, with a certainty that shook me to my core, that I would die before I let any more harm come to Alara Ashworth. I sat there, motionless, as the light filled the room, the diary resting in my lap like a sleeping child. My world had been remade. My principles had not been broken. They had been redefined. Honor was not about blind loyalty to a distant king. It was about protecting the innocent soul under my own roof. Duty was not a burden. It was a privilege. A sudden, frantic pounding on the library door shattered the morning's peace. It flew open without my leave, and my steward, his face ashen, stumbled into the room. "My lord, forgive the intrusion, but a carriage, it's coming up the main drive." I rose to my feet, my heart turning to ice. "Whose carriage?" "My lord," he stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "It bears the seal of the king's special agent. It is Lord Beaumont." For a single, frozen moment, the world stood still. Beaumont. Here. The hunter was at the door. Then, the fire I thought had been extinguished in me, the cold, calculating precision of the man I used to be, roared back to life, now forged with a new and terrifying purpose. I turned to my steward, my voice low and sharp, leaving no room for fear or error. "Thomas, you will go down to the main parlor. You will greet Lord Beaumont with all the courtesy his station requires. Offer him my finest brandy. Tell him I was unexpectedly delayed and will be with him presently. Then, you will find Mrs. Gable. You will tell her that Miss Ashworth is to remain in her chambers. She's not to open her door to anyone but me. No one, under any circumstances, is to enter the east wing. Do you understand me?" "Yes, my lord," Thomas whispered, his fear replaced by the simple clarity of a direct order. He bowed and rushed from the room. I took a steadying breath, my eyes falling on the diary still resting in the chair. Her life, her soul, entrusted to me. I gently closed the book and placed it securely within my coat, the worn leather a warm, solid presence against my chest. I walked out of the library, not as a man going to his doom, but as a king ready to defend his castle. I straightened my cuffs, smoothed my waistcoat, and composed my features into a mask of mild, aristocratic boredom. I found Lord Beaumont in the parlor, a glass of my brandy in his hand, admiring a portrait of my grandfather. He was a man of medium height, impeccably dressed, with a pleasant, almost handsome face. But his eyes were small and dark, constantly moving, taking in everything with a predatory stillness. They held no warmth, only a chilling, reptilian intelligence. "Lord Croftwood," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr. He offered a slight bow. "Forgive this early morning intrusion. I find myself in your part of the country and could not resist the opportunity to pay my respects to one of the crown's most steadfast servants." "Lord Beaumont," I replied, my own voice a study in cool civility. "You are welcome at Croftwood, though I confess your reputation precedes you. I had imagined your work would keep you far too busy for social calls." A thin smile touched his lips. "One must make time. It allows me to gauge the health of the kingdom, to ensure all is in order. I trust all is in order here at the manor. No, unexpected guests." His eyes glided around the room, missing nothing. "My only unexpected guest is you, my lord," I said, walking to the decanter to pour myself a small measure of brandy. My hand did not shake. "My household is a model of tranquility, as it has always been." He took a small sip of his drink. "A tragedy, is it not, about Lord Ashworth?" I knew him slightly. A passionate man, but his passions were misplaced. His sister, I hear, has simply vanished. Elara, I believe her name was. A frail, sickly thing, they say. Mute even. One wonders where such a person could go. He was watching me, his eyes boring into mine, searching for the slightest flicker of a lie. The man I was yesterday would have flinched. The man I was today met his gaze without blinking. Elara's diary was a shield around my heart. I concern myself with the affairs of loyal men, Lord Beaumont, not the families of traitors. The Ashworth name is a blight on the peerage. Their fate is of no interest to me. His smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. Of course not. Still, one must be thorough. Rumors abound in these uncertain times. Sometimes the most loyal houses are preyed upon by fugitives seeking shelter, presuming upon old acquaintances. I allowed a note of ice to enter my voice. "Are you presuming something, my lord?" He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Not at all, merely making an observation. Perhaps, for the sake of formality, you would indulge an old soldier and grant me a brief tour of your magnificent home. I have a great appreciation for architecture." This was it, the demand behind the velvet words. My ancestors stared down from the walls, their gazes stern and proud. I drew myself up to my full height, letting the silence stretch, letting my indignation mount like a physical force in the room. "Lord Beaumont," I said, my voice resonating with 5 centuries of noble authority. "My family built this house on a foundation of unwavering loyalty to the crown. My grandfather died for the king. My father served him for 40 years. I have publicly and repeatedly condemned the very traitors you hunt. And you come into my home and ask for a tour as if you were a common constable searching for stolen chickens? You insult my name, my father's name, and the honor of this house. Are you, a special agent of the king, officially suggesting that I, the Earl of Croftwood, am a liar and a traitor?" I had turned his own weapon against him. He was a hunter of those with sullied reputations, of the weak and the frightened. He was not prepared for a direct confrontation with a powerful earl on his own ground, an earl whose loyalty was famously, almost stubbornly, unimpeachable. I saw a flash of uncertainty in his cold eyes. He had overplayed his hand. To press the issue now would be a grave political risk. He could find nothing and make a powerful enemy, or he could be right and accuse a man beloved by his peers. He lowered his glass. The charming facade fell away, revealing the bitter anger beneath. You mistake me, Lord Croftwood. No insult was intended. Then I suggest you choose your words and your requests more carefully in the future, I said, turning my back on him and placed my glass down. It was a gesture of dismissal. A final checkmate. He stood there for a moment, the silence thick with his fury. Then I heard his footsteps. I thank you for your hospitality, my lord, he said, his voice tight. I shall trouble you no longer. I did not turn to watch him go. I listened as his boots receded down the hall, as the great front door opened and closed. Only when I heard the sound of his carriage wheels crunching on the gravel, fading into the distance, did I allow myself to breathe. The danger had passed. I did not walk, I ran. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding with a wild, triumphant terror. I ran to the east wing, to her door. I did not knock. I threw it open. She was standing in the middle of the room, her back pressed against the wall, her face a mask of pure, white horror. She had heard his voice. She knew who had been here. I stopped in the doorway, my chest heaving. Our eyes met across the room. I saw her terror, her belief that all was lost. I had to show her. I had to make her understand that everything had changed. I walked slowly towards her, my hands open at my sides. I did not stop until I was standing directly before her. I reached into my coat and pulled out her diary. Her eyes widened. She thought he had found it, that I was returning it before they took me away. But I did not give it back to her. I simply held it in my hand, a sacred object. He is gone, Ilara, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I had never spoken her name aloud before. It felt right. He is gone, and he will not be back. You are safe. Her eyes searched mine, desperate for the truth. I could see the question she could not ask. What happens now? I gave her a small, gentle smile. I pulled a quill and inkpot from a nearby writing desk. I opened her diary, not to the beginning, not to the pages filled with pain, but to the very back, where a dozen clean, white, empty pages remained. I held the open book and the quill out to her. My voice was a soft vow. Your story is not over, I said. The pages of sadness are finished. From this day forward, our story begins. Let's write the next chapter together. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. Her lips, for so long, a tight line of pain, trembled and then parted, curving into the most beautiful, radiant smile I had ever seen. Her hand, no longer trembling, rose and did not take the quill. Instead, her fingers gently, tentatively, intertwined with mine. It was an answer more powerful than any word. In the end, I learned the most profound truth. Honor is not found in blind service to a crown or a flag. It is found in the fierce, unwavering protection of a single, precious soul. Strength is not the absence of fear, but the courage to face it for the sake of another. And the most powerful voice in the world, the one that can change a man's entire existence, does not need to make a sound. For more tales of love that defy the odds, I invite you to subscribe to the channel.